introduce myself. Many of you know me. I'm one of the founders of this Kelly Writers House, and we're celebrating 15 years of the Writers House pretty much this week. 15 years ago this week, some people gathered together. I, having gotten the keys to what was at the time an empty house, it didn't look nearly as nice as this. It was a little bit run down, built in 1851 and not really cared for about 10 or 15 years, that much. So it needed a lot of work. The front door didn't lock. We had no heat or electricity at the time. We gathered together, staff and faculty and students and alumni and one trustee and some Philadelphians who were otherwise unaffiliated with the project or with Penn in any way, and we spent hours figuring out what this place would be. We decided upon a writer-centered, student-centered, collaborative, communitarian writers hangout space, which would then, that was a lot, which would then inspire people to do the kind of writing that would make them happy and so forth. I don't want to tell that story in the straight narrative way. Here's what I want to do. And the structure of what I'm about to say for a few minutes, just to mark the 15 years of the Writers' House, and to say to some people like Tom Devaney, who lives and breathes Writers' House and who worked here for many years, but probably hasn't thought about it in the way I'm about to structure it. This is for him, but it's also for someone like Eric Umansky, who among others in this room, and Suzanne, who took my courses on a day in an era in which I didn't, when the students came in the room, simply say, if you think this about the reading, sit on this side of the room, and if you think this about the reading, sit on this side of the room. When Eric and Suzanne took my courses, and Eric in particular, this was funny, there were 4 positions to take. A lot of the time there were 4 positions. And when we were studying the Cold War, the culture of the Cold War in the 1950s, before the Writers' House was created, we were studying the Cold War, and he came in on a number of occasions, and the options were, if your position coincides with the reactionary position, sit over here in this corner. And if your position coincides with the conservative position, sit in that corner. And if your position coincides with the liberal position, sit in this corner. And if your position coincides with the radical position, sit in this corner. Eric was always in the radical position, except on some days when he wanted to get my goat, and he sat in the reactionary position, which sometimes is the same as the radical position. And you know all about that, this being 2010. But anyway, leaving that entirely aside, I assure you, entirely aside, I'm not even in a subterranean sort of way referring to 2010. You may decide that that's what I'm saying, but I am definitely not saying that, because what I'd like to do is I would like to very briefly, and I have no notes at all. I haven't thought about this at all. I have no notes. Okay, I am going to tell the story of the Writers' House. I'm not doing the reactionary story of the Writers' House, but I'm going to tell the conservative story of the Writers' House, the liberal story of the Writers' House, and the radical story of the Writers' House in that order. And then what I'm going to do is and I don't even know what order we're going in, except that I know Suzanne's going last, because they're going to do some play kind of stuff, and we have to move some things around. So I don't even know what order I'm going to do it, but I'm going to introduce our 4 readers, who are each, I'll explain why Carrie is not quite this in a minute, but they're my former students. In order to celebrate the 15 years of the Writers' House, it was Jessica's idea that we invite 4 former students of mine to just celebrate with us. And in 2 of the 4 cases, they weren't even around when the Writers' House was around, but they've both been part of the Writers' House community one way or other. And Carrie, who's not even my former student, but was the director of this very same Writers' House for many years, obviously was associated with it. And Alicia Oltuski, who is here somewhere, Alicia was very much part of it, so she's sort of the more recent of the 4. And I'm going to introduce them not in any professional sort of resume sort of way, because everyone who's here in this room got the announcements and they know all about the publications and what they do. I'm going to introduce them from the heart. I'm going to introduce them as their former teacher. And in Carrie's case, not former teacher, but we'll get, it'll count. She learned a few things. All right, here we go first. You ready? And I'm glad we're recording this, because I only intend to ever do this once, but it's 15 years. All right, here's the conservative version of the formation of the Writers' House. Ready, Eric? You know it? Okay. All right. The university began to lose its sense of the most traditional values of teaching and learning. Big classes, students who had no connection to the mentors that their faculty could be. The ability to sit around a table, almost European style, Europe's a bad word, but in the traditional style of teacher and student, to sit around a text and to pore over it in the most important back to basic sort of way, to figure out what it means and to do it together. You see how conservative can be radical too. To do it together, to do it collaboratively, but to actually do the work rather than the kind of professionalized style of the teacher knows everything and the student doesn't know anything. The Writers' House was an in loco parentis, which the fools in the 60s got rid of, those students. The people who brought us the high-rises were also the people who claimed to be the 60s left at Penn. Those people, they got rid of in loco parentis. And this is the conservative version of the Writers' House. And the Writers' House was a gesture of bringing back in loco parentis, bringing back a place where students who were wayward, particularly these right-brain students who were wayward, to have a space where they got where that crazy lack of discipline that characterizes artists got a kind of structure, got some adult supervision, and found the structure of the Writers' House to be a place where work could actually get done instead of drugs and rock and roll and sex. I mean, well, there was a little bit of that here, but the point is that mostly it was a place where the most basic academic work could get done, and we could intervene against the slack, the lax university culture of easy learning and go through the paces and have rigorous mentorships like such as Max Appel provided to Alicia. That real old-fashioned back-to-basics education, and we did it. For 15 years, we've represented a thumbing of the nose. Is that what you do? Yeah, I think that's what you do. A thumbing of the nose. Maybe not really. That. The raspberry, saying no. There we go. Saying no to easy, facile, take your courses and do nothing else at the university. You know, red and blue, right? Dear old Pennsylvania. Yeah, well, they kind of overlap. So there's the conservative version of the Writers' House. I'm not very good at conservative. Okay. The liberal version of the Writers' House. This is such a communitarian, beautiful place where people's talents and resources, talents brought out by all the resources that are available, can be drawn out by really intellectual TLC that is provided to every student who is treated like an individual, who has individual needs and talents, that needs to basically find a place where they can be what they can be and get lots and lots and lots and lots of help, right? A space that's kind as opposed to forbidding. A space that's the alternative of the sitting in rows lecture hall, which predominates the research university. A place that is really like the alternative spaces that a lot of culture-minded people in earlier generations built so that creativity could be nourished. So an alternative to the Research One University with its goals of essentially mass marketing learners. And that dream of reaching toward perfection, of students who could come and have it all work out in an intimate space, is something that we've been doing for 15 years. I'm not really good at liberal either. The radical version of the Writers' House. Tom's waiting for this. This is being recorded and streamed live, so I have to be a little careful. Okay. The universities don't work. Students are receivers of education, and they forget pretty much whatever they learned. The relationship between the student and the class is dependent entirely on the relationship between the student and the teacher, but the teacher can only be seen through binoculars or through the intermediary of the TA. Graduate programs dominate. Undergraduates are forgotten. Huge empires of what are called student life are set up, and the faculty are the last people that you go to when you have a problem because they're Brahmin and protected from the needs of undergraduates. The dollars flow through big science, and creativity and writing and the humanities overall are bang for the buck because we're cheap, but forgotten for the most part in priorities of the university. But there was a university that either did or was made to think that this kind of experiment could work, and it set itself up as a non-curricular space. And by the way, curriculum equals dollars. Curriculum equals a portion of tuition. Co-curricular, non-curricular space means nada. It means all the hours of the week when you're not in class might as well be frittered away off campus at Smokey Joe's, or in fraternities and sororities, which we don't really control much anyway, or in a coffee shop at 42nd Street off the grid. Fine, stay as far away as you can. But a little house on Locust Walk, which was granted the opportunity to provide a completely alternative pedagogical space, arose. And some of the ideas that some of us had been experimenting with for many years, and I wish I could name them, but I'll just say Bob Lucid for one name, brought together a lot of people who wanted to try something completely different. And 15 years later, the university recognizes that this is a really good idea. And the supporters of the arts, and supporters of alternative teaching, and supporters of the value of the relationship between the student and the individual professor began to be worthwhile. People who are donors realize that they want to give to something where there's a huge impact, an immediate impact. People who are alumni who want to come back and actually learn rather than just go to a football game or be asked for money start to show up as you have this afternoon. And people who care about the future of creative students, creative people who don't get talked out of creativity and pushed into pre-professional programs at the graduate level or MBAs and so forth, get to come here and actually be told, be proved through alumni mentorships and so forth, that there is a life of creativity possible, even though the market is changing, journalistic and otherwise changing like crazy. And the Writers' House becomes that. It's also a back-to-basics traditional place where learning gets done. It is definitely a place where communitarianism and old-style alternatives to the mean research university is possible and almost near perfectibility. But it is first and foremost a way of saying that the pedagogy of student to student, students can teach student, is good, and the pedagogy of I know you don't, I have you want, I speak you listen, I have knowledge, you don't have any knowledge, I give you receive, is wrong and not very helpful when you're trying to learn. That's the radical version. All in favor of the radical version, raise your hand. All right, more than I would suspect. But I want to remind you that the conservative version is just as important. Here's why, and I'll stop talking after this. The conservative version isn't really conservative. The conservative values, or traditional values, are not very necessarily conservative, except in the sense of wanting to conserve what universities were founded to do, which is to configure their infrastructure, their buildings, their maintenance, their greens, their arts, their public sculptures, their dorms, configure them in whatever way is necessary so that students come here and 4 years later they go out having been changed by knowledge, by learning, by understanding, and by hopes for a better future for everybody. It doesn't matter how you configure it. Take the money of the university and configure it in any way that works. And if it doesn't work, don't do that anymore. And that's a conservative view of the Writers' House. We're a symbol for trying something a different way. So I want to take a minute, before I introduce my four friends, I want to take a minute to congratulate everybody in this room who's ever been a supporter of the Writers, who cares about the Writers' House. I want to look at Jessica, who's applying to the Writers' House, is applying to the University of Pennsylvania, not to the Writers' House, pushed early decision and said, I want to come to Penn, partly because the Writers' House exists, because when she gets here, if she gets here, sorry. Cross your fingers, everybody, on the count of three for Jessica. Okay, it's done, Jessica. When Jessica shows up, she has a place to be, a soft couch, people who will care for her intellectually and aesthetically, someone will come along and be her mentor, maybe Max, and she will wind up, being on the verge of publishing an important book years later. That's what we're about, and so I want to make sure everybody in this room who's ever thought that the Writers' House is a good idea or just decided to spend a few hours celebrating it with us, I want everybody to thank each other for doing this without a lot of supporters politically interfering for us in those first vulnerable years. We could easily have been shut down. Easily. Not that there are enemies out there, but there's spaces like hard to keep. So thank you to everyone. Thank you to writers who've been here. Thank you to graduate students, Sarah Dowling, who probably should be writing a paper or dissertation or something. Thank you to our amazing staff, who I'm not going to name by names right now, but I hope they'll get a chance to meet you later. Thank you to staff. Thank you to alumni who actually, write us a check for $40 a year to help this thing going, and this is exactly what we need. Thank you to writers like Max Apple and others, Tom Devaney and others who've decided to teach in this space because it's a great place to be. Thank you for people who decided to bring children here today because this is a family place. Thank you for the readers who are going to be reading, and thank you everybody for doing this. Let's congratulate each other on 15 years of something really, really different.